Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. How was your commute this morning? Was it down a flight of stairs, along the corridor perhaps, or even from the bed to the sofa? Wherever you are in the world, COVID-19 has forced huge changes in the way we work, with most people now working from home and online. Yet at the same time, we're all craving social contact. And who would have thought a chat with colleagues, just an opportunity to say hello and exchange ideas. So where's this all going? Today, we've got two very well qualified people to gaze into the crystal ball on our behalf and give us an idea of how the workplace is changing. They are Nicola Gillen, who is an author of the Rethink Design Guide, Architecture for the Post-Pandemic World. She analyzes trends in the workplace and helps architects and real estate firms plan ahead. Hello, Nicola.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for the invitation.
And whereabouts are you at the moment, Nicola?
I'm in St Albans, just outside London.
Okay, great. We're also joined by Richard Howard, an international partner with Cushman and Wakefield, one of the biggest commercial real estate companies in the world. Richard deals with the likes of Facebook, Google, and Apple, and their quests for the ideal office space. Hello, Richard.
Hi, everyone. I'm here in London, in Clapham in southwest London. Locked in as everyone else is. I'm looking forward to the conversation tonight.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. Nicola, it seems pretty clear to me that there is a revolution going on, but can we go back a few years before the pandemic and talk a bit about the kind of rapid changes that are already taking place? Some people here who are watching may not have been into an office for some time now, and I think it'd be a good idea to paint a picture of how that space has been changing very rapidly over the past few years. Nicola.
Sure. Yeah. So I think people can sometimes think that, this idea of open plan offices is a new thing. In fact, it's about 120 years old and came from the industrial age where organizations established areas where workers could sit alongside factories. So it's actually a very old-fashioned idea. And what's incredible is, 120 years ago, they were designed to keep people in rows so that the boss could see them, monitor what they're doing in a traditional command and control model. And so many offices are still laid out like that today. Now, if you imagine the technology those office workers had 120 years ago, and you look at the technology we have today, it could not have been predicted. So certainly, aside from that, in terms of the longer view, we've had the technology to work in a mobile and remote way probably for 25 years. I remember actually at the time of 9/11, I was living in New York, and at that point, the organizations we were working with who had agile working programs where they were looking at flexible working, they were up and running very quickly after that event, and that was really one of the big catalysts for organizations looking at office work leaving the building, work leaving the office.
Yeah, it's that word flexibility, isn't it? That both technology and also people, I'm thinking of organizations like WeWork, the concepts of hot desking, not having a fixed desk that belongs to a set person. It's a much more sort of fluid, flexible environment.
Yeah, I mean, work is not a place we go, it's a thing we do. And it's been that way for my entire career, for sure. I have never had a fixed desk or office. Work is something that follows me, right? It's in my phone, it's on my laptop. It's not a place nobody comes and clocks in at 9 o'clock. I'm in the building now, so I'm going to start working. It's something that unfortunately we're doing from much earlier in the morning until much later at night.
That's an amazing shift, isn't it? Because I think, I was a journalist, and as a reporter, a lot of your work is out in the field. But I'm thinking throughout the 1990s, really, I went into an office, and that was a fixed thing.
Yeah, and looking back now, the reason we did that was because management didn't trust us. Trust was the single biggest barrier to any kind of flexible working. And still, very few now, but certainly pre-pandemic, there was a lot of organizations still that had the mindset of, if I can't see you, then I don't believe you're working. And if you're at home, you're certainly on Netflix and there's no way you're doing any work. So, you know, those perceptions of the pandemic has effectively, and there were plenty of organizations challenging that and working in a very agile way pre-COVID. But certainly there is no grounds to stand on now, because we've had a globally enforced work from home experiment where really nobody can challenge that it doesn't work anymore. In fact, talking to employment lawyers, where people would put in flexible working requests before the pandemic, the onus was on the employee to demonstrate that they could maintain productivity. A lot of the lawyers now talk about the onus shifting to the employer to demonstrate that they can't be productive. And that's going to be a much more difficult case to make.
I think this is absolutely fascinating, because when I first looked at this idea, I thought, I looked at the idea in terms of, here we are working at home, and is the office redundant? Is that building redundant? But what we're really talking about is a much, much broader shift. Is what does work mean? How do you evaluate that? And then what do you do in terms of, you know, setting up places to work, or, you know, how do you allow people to work better? So it's a much bigger question than I had initially thought. Richard, I want to jump to you now. Sure. You work, in actual fact, you both work for Cushman and Wakefield. I should say that, but you are dealing definitely with the numbers side of things, the business side of things. It must have been a torrid past 9-10 months or so. What's been happening?
Yes, absolutely correct. It has been since the sort of tail end of March last year. It went very, very quiet, very, very quickly, and I think occupiers wanted to just try and work out what was going on. Offices emptied very quickly. Central London, for those that don't live here, became a ghost town, particularly in the city rather than the West End. Around Bank Station was almost completely devoid of people, and that went on till well into June. And I would say that there's been a hiatus in any kind of decision making by occupiers about what they want to do, unless they have a decision forced upon them by, you know, a lease event or something like that, where they have to decide. There's been a bit of a hiatus on everything, which is interesting, because it's not to say that people haven't been recruiting. We act for, you know, as you say, some of the biggest sort of tech media companies, and Facebook recruited more people in the last couple of quarters of last year than they ever have done in any other 2 quarters in their existence, but on the phone and from home. But the intention will be, in the long run, we believe, to bring people back into the office in some form or guise. I think, to echo what Nicola is saying, I think, you know, that relationship has changed a huge amount between employee and employer. And we think that the kind of office that you're going to have to provide now, or workplace, I should say, is somewhere where you really need to persuade people to come in there. Like, why am I coming in here? And it was beginning to go that way. So we worked on a big scheme in central London at King's Cross, and that showed how much amenity and stuff that an office offered, other than sitting at a desk, mattered. But it was still, I'd say, still the case that it was come to work and work first, and then the amenities help. I think that's going the other way, and I think the amenities are going to become the central fact.
I want to come back to you in a second, Richard, about that, and then talk about because I've been to King's Cross and I've seen what the work you've done there, and then talk about how that shift, that sort of focus is coming. So we'll come back to that in just a second. Nicola, you've been doing surveys of people who are working from home. What have you found?
So we launched a survey about 6 weeks into the pandemic, and the data that we collected over the summer, so it's several months of the first lockdown, we had 64,000 people respond to the survey. So it was the largest industry survey of its kind. And 75% of the 64,000 said that they could focus as well at home as they could in the office. And collaboration had in fact gone up by 10%. That's kind of the good news. On the downside, only 55% of people reported a sense of well-being, and only 50% reported a connection to company culture. And that's probably one of the most alarming figures when we present that to senior leaders. And what's interesting also is the survey stayed open. We've just issued a second round before Christmas, so we'll have more results in a few months' time. But over that period, well-being has continued to decline, and stress levels have continued to increase. And also, we've had very different results when we slice the data by generation. So the youngest in the workforce have been struggling the most for a whole host of reasons, including being back in parents' houses, being in cramped shared accommodation, missing their colleagues, the social side. The oldest in the workforce, who very generally speaking were the most resistant to flexible working pre-COVID, have had the best experience. And they're also, so baby boomers have had the best experience. And that's probably because they've got a room they can work in, they don't have kids running around, and they've got plenty of people to delegate to. So what we're finding is that in many organizations, baby boomers are still the decision makers. So they've had a bit of an epiphany over this whole period, and they're now coming back where they were the most resistant to change before COVID. They're now coming back, actually leaping the organization forward by 10 or 20 years in terms of ways of working and depending on their starting point.
Okay, one more question just to sort of follow that up is, are there, I mean, we're all having to work from home, we're relying on the laptops in front of us to, communicate. That's an enormous shift. It shows that people can work from home. Do you expect that to continue? Is that something, are there jobs that simply can't be done this way?
Well, it depends on the role and it depends on people's stage in life. So I think, a young 25-year-old lawyer is going to pretty quickly want to get back to the city centre because they're going to want everything that a city centre brings. Somebody who's maybe 45, has kids and school runs and all of that sort of stuff to do, they are going to want a much more flexible way of working. So with the data set, 78% of people said they wanted flexible working to continue in some way. And in fact, when we've done more detailed surveys, only about 3% of people say they want to come back to the office full time. And only about 5% of people say they want to work from home full time. So actually, the vast majority is somewhere in the middle. And we're doing a lot of work with organizations at the moment to figure out what that balance should be. Should it be 2 days, 3 days, 4 days?
Okay. So, Richard, if we look at retail and the high street, it's pretty grim. I mean, it really does look like it's closing down. But what we're saying here now is that the office or the workspace is going to stay there, but it's undergoing dramatic shifts. Let's talk a bit about King's Cross. If anyone's, if you live in the UK and you're familiar with King's Cross and Pancras, it's that space just to the northwest of the station. There's lots of cafes, there's areas which you can walk out in the open. It's a hive of activity. There's a canal. It's a really attractive place to be. How's it going to get? How is that going to change?
I think it will. I think the workplaces that will change in what is actually inside them and what companies offer. It's interesting to draw. Actually, just going back to something Nicola said, just to really sort of reiterate what she was saying. The other thing I think that young people are really suffering from at home is, I'm 49 years old. I've made my contacts. I know my clients. I've got the social capital I need to carry on. They haven't. So if you're 25 to 30 years old and you're trying to build your network of contacts in any business, ours, yours, whatever, you're simply not doing that. This is a very good medium for keeping on with your existing networks. It's not good for building, and that's come across more and more. I think it's very interesting because the same developer that has provided King's Cross is also developing a scheme called Brent Cross Town, which is just to the north of King's Cross. And it's interesting to compare and contrast. I won't turn this into an advert for the schemes, but one is very amenity heavy. King's Cross, there's lots of retail, it's good fun, there's a university at the heart of it. The one that's coming is going to have something called Project Play, where there will be the world-class sporting facilities in London for participatory sports for men, women, multi-generations. They've been around the world curating the best gym, the best swimming pools, and that is going to be an inherent part of the offer there. If you'd said that 10 years ago, people would have thought you were crazy to be offering all that extra stuff that's would have felt very extraneous to making a place attractive and compelling to an office occupier. Now it's almost vital to be offering something like that. And we've been presenting it to various people who would know our market very well. And they've been looking at it saying, crikey, it's almost like you've done this tailor-made for a post-pandemic world. So it's all the things that you can do as well as just be in the office. I actually personally, and Nicola and I haven't rehearsed this, and she may disagree. There was a lot of talk towards the end of leading up towards the end of last year about designing offices around COVID and UV lights in air conditioning systems, things like that. Personally, I think maybe in certain markets, but in London and New York and big urban centres, you either have a pandemic or you don't, and because you've got to get on a mass transit system to get there. And so once you get through that, something that is coming back, and it's interesting to what Nicola says about decision makers. I agree, it's still boomers who are largely the decision makers, but very, very influential in the workforce now are generations below that who are now team leaders. They're the talent that these people are desperate to keep. Apple, Amazon, Facebook, it's why they take these big offices, and they really do care about sustainability. And just before COVID hit, you could see sustainability doing that up the graph of what people were bothered by. And then it fell off because of COVID, and you can just see it really beginning to climb up again now.
What does that mean specifically? I mean, you're talking about carbon emissions. When you say sustainability in terms of an office, what do you mean?
Well, Nicola will shoot me down in flames because I'm the ignorant one here. But to me, it means things like at Brent Cross, it means a timber building, which is not generally done in London. It's begun in North America and Canada and the US and Australia. It's pretty common now. There's all timber buildings in Sydney at a place called Barangaroo, and they're really attractive. So that will be coming through. It will be about emissions. What's interesting is that a very good deal of large corporates aim to be carbon neutral by 2030. Real estate accounts for something like, it's in crazy numbers. Is it 4/5 of carbon emissions across the world? It is a serious impact. So you've got this combination of companies like Microsoft who actually want to be carbon negative, plus the space they're in being a big contributor to the carbon footprint we make. So that is having to change, and that is being looked at. And timber construction is one of those things because you can literally recycle the building. But Nicola is far more knowledgeable about these things than I am and the trends that.
Okay, Nicola, we'll come to you in just a second. We're getting some questions coming in, so I'll start taking questions in just a second. So if you can please start putting type away the boxes down on the right hand side of your screen. Nicola, so just give us a sort of clearer idea. Can you just describe the office space? Some of our groups, when we do our study tours, we look at all aspects of economy. So we've had groups in Korea look at WeWork's offices. We have seen software programmers working out of a former Soviet apartment block near the Russian border. We've seen a whole range of stuff. But let's talk about London. If you're talking about the more modern offices, what have been the trends in the last couple of years, and what do you expect to see change now? Just give us some descriptions. I'm thinking about your book as well.
Sure. So I would say if we think about first of all, if we think about the ground floor, so what has shifted massively is the kind of traditional or old-fashioned idea. Canary Wharf is changing a lot now, but how it was originally set up, which was very much the American model of towers, of power. Thou shalt not pass, and there was a security guard at the door, and you had to be badged and tagged and tackled to the ground and all of that sort of stuff. So the days of that are clearly long gone. So one of the key shifts as you come towards an office building is the ground floor. So now the ground floor is open. You walk in, there's coffee shops, there's couches. You are to linger. You are welcome. It's open space. And the security barrier starts further up the building. So that's one of the things that's shifted. And then as you go up the building, if you imagine the whole container of a building that an organization might take pre-COVID, about 50% of that space would have been for individual work. So desks, something like that. The rest of the space would have been collaborative and well-being sort of environments. So, already pre-COVID, there was a big shift. Now, a traditional office building, which there are still plenty around, that would be something like 80% individual. And of course, it lay empty because we have been doing occupancy studies of buildings for about 30 years now. And we know that on average, we use our office buildings about 60% of the time, because they provide space that we don't need. So what most organizations were doing pre-COVID was already redesigning their building to suit the way work is done now.
Mm. Richard, I'm going to bring some questions in just a second. Is there the money to do this? It seems that many, I don't know if many firms are money building up capital, but small, medium-sized firms must have been burning through the cash.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some occupiers who are having to seriously revisit what they pay for and what they can afford in London. And one of the big debates going on is whether companies will shift to a more hub and spoke kind of setup, where you may have quite a small representative office in the center of town in the expensive parts, but maybe have something that is a little bit more cost effective, maybe a little bit closer to where the workforce lives, where most people will go to every day, but then go into collaboration space, etc. During the at certain points of the week, and that will obviously be structured for the workforce to do that. I think in terms of developers, I think it's something they're going to just have to come to terms with in providing that kind of space. As Nicola says, spaces just have to be more open. I think occupiers used to think purely with the left-hand side of their brain, or whichever side it is that's the unemotional side, just the pounds, shillings and pence. They now think with that colourful side of the brain, and they know they have to do that. And we've already seen people go, when I first started working, people would either want to be in the centre of the West End, the centre of the city. They certainly wouldn't cross the south of the river. They would never have gone to King's Cross. And you've seen people adapt more and more and more as they've gone to more amenity heavy areas. And I think that is just something that the developer will have to answer even more if they want to survive in an ultra competitive market.
Okay, I think we've got some good questions coming in here. I'm going to take Sheila de Beleg first, followed by Hilary Matthews, and then Diane Cook. So go ahead, Sheila. Do say where you are. I think we've got 3 Brits to start with, but I know we've got Australians and Americans on the line too. Go ahead, Sheila.
Yeah, I'm speaking from London. So as a Londoner, isn't what most people want to avoid is the miserable commute into work on overcrowded public transport. Workplaces nearer home, walkable if possible, is the ideal, surely.
Sheila, I think you live just around the corner from Richard. So
I do, I think.
You need advice.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a key question, isn't it, Nicola? I mean, for employers, where you are, the location. I mean, this is something you've spoken about.
Yeah, the commute, I mean, it's interesting. The commute has always been seen as a very negative thing and a colossal waste of time and a colossal, vehicle for passing on viruses. I would be very interested to see what the general rate of colds and flus is around the world at the moment, because I suspect it's unbelievably lower than it usually is.
It is.
Right.
The research shows it's plummeted.
I'm not surprised. So I think apart from health, time was a big factor. Interestingly, over the period of doing research over the last 10 months, there's been an unexpected, rosy hue put on the commute, because it was our separation between work and life, and that's become sadly missed by people now. And one of the other perceptions, of course, which is wrong, is that, old-fashioned employers may have thought that people working from home work less, but much research shows that actually people work much longer hours and they work beyond the time of their commute if they're working from home. So, but yes, I mean, from a carbon footprint point of view, people do not want to be trooping in and out of cities. They especially don't want to be trooping in and out of cities in order to sit by themselves in an office and talk to everybody else on Zoom, which is what's been happening over the last 10 months.
Okay.
So,
I want to bring in Hilary Matthews, because this sort of follows on from this. So it's a very good question, and we'll get Richard to answer it. And it points to corporate responsibility as well. Hilary, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, Hilary. Hi.
Hi. I'm also a South Londoner, and I'm absolutely, my biggest concern. I'm sorry, this is maybe a bit London centric for our other listeners in other parts of the world, but my very, very biggest concern in London is the lack of affordable housing for lower income people. I've often wondered whether some of this massive office space that is being built in the city and elsewhere could be converted into affordable, not luxury housing for rich people, but affordable housing. It's just something that I'm absolutely very, very concerned
Really
with.
good question there, Hilary. And I think there are two aspects to that question. One is the corporate, the moral responsibility that the big employers have. You know, they're the major employers, and they occupy so much real estate as well. And then it's in purely in terms of providing an environment where employers can, of different backgrounds, do have the opportunity to live and work in London.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll take that. I think it's a very interesting question. It's very true. And even not so much on a social level, but young workers find it very hard to live anywhere near where they work. So you do have these very sort of upmarket office developments in the centre of town, particularly in London, where rents or house prices to buy are very expensive, and they can't live anywhere near where they work, and that is definitely an issue. I think in terms of repurposing buildings, it's tricky because they're designed in a certain way. I think what you'll probably see is, as the development pipeline of new buildings comes through, that will change a bit. You're already seeing certain developers have got cold feet about certain schemes that they were going to provide. So in some ways, the market will find its own course and correct itself, which it will do. I wholeheartedly agree with you that the affordable housing. I've got 4 grown-up children myself who live at home here. I simply don't know how they will afford to stay living in this location because of what's happened. It's a real problem. There is an interesting nuance to it, which is that if you're Sadiq Khan and you push up affordable housing so high as a percentage of a new residential development, that actually the residential developer thinks that's actually now unsustainable. Ironically, you end up with less affordable housing because less development happens and less affordable housing is provided at the lower percentage. But it's a very valid point, and I think you will see some repurposing. It's certainly switched around from one way or the other as the markets have changed over the years.
Okay, Diane Cook, I'm going to keep your question in reserve for a second because it moves the debate on. It's about travel. We're going to come back to that in just a second. But Nicola, can you answer the same question? You must be seeing a lot of moves to create affordable housing among councils in London and elsewhere. Are they working? Is there more of a drive? What's going on?
I think there is, and this goes back to the previous question, that there has been an increased driver for mixed use walkable neighborhoods for some time. So especially younger people are looking to live in a neighborhood where they can live, work and play. And that's growing massively. We've been over providing offices, and what we've actually seen amongst corporate occupiers is that they have been taking buildings or taking parts of mixed use development where they can also acquire residential space for their graduates, and 6 months or 12 months rent as part of your graduate program becomes part of the package, which is incredibly, obviously, positive and powerful for the employee, but from the employer's perspective, it's a bit like repeating halls of residences where they end up creating really tight-knit teams because they're living and working together.
Okay, I do want to come back to that. We'll move on in just a second, but in terms of the kind of work I would expect from major corporations in the city to be doing in places like the Isle of Dogs. I mean, we've taken people to community centres in that area, and the crime and the poverty there is just quite shocking, We've got a good question from Lois Towart, who is in Australia. Lois, go ahead. You there, Lois? It's a reasonable hour. It's not it was 3:30 in the morning or 4:30 in the morning yesterday. Today, it's now 7:30. Is that right?
Yes, it's nice. It's where the sun is shining as it usually does in Sydney. I'm in Pyrmont, which is a suburb really close into the CBD of Sydney, and I'm actually echoing. Nicola made a very important comment about the segmenting of responses, and that the younger people found it a lot harder. And it got steadily easier as you got older. And then both, I think it was Sheila and Hilary made further comments about the commute, which is actually also the other problem that we're seeing. And look, again, Sydney echoes all the problems you've got there. It's got the horror commute for those that can't afford to live close. It's got that segmenting by age. It's also got a lack of affordable housing. And you're really touching on those points about a lot of the business, and my comments were that a lot of business is in the air, and I'm getting it. Actually my background. Okay, yes, Nicholas, I am an economist, but I have worked as a valuer, which is equivalent to a chartered surveyor, which Nicola and Richard will be very familiar with. So consequently, I'm getting a lot of feedback, particularly from people within real estate firms, that mentoring young people is virtually impossible online. You have to basically, if you want to build your team and you want young people to come through and participate, you have to offer it. And it gets back to a comment that was made in The Economist magazine. A lot of business is in the air. If you want to work in a certain enterprise, you need to go where those enterprises are based. And that's one of those aspects of our human nature. So I really would be interested to sort of flesh that out a bit more, in that a lot of businesses, yes, you can be very formal and do it on Zoom, but you can't have that coffee shop interaction where you walk in and you run into X from a competing company and he goes, oh, by the way, we're recruiting. Those conversations are impossible to replace.
Nicola, that's absolutely crucial. That's what I miss. I mean, we just, my wife is incredibly stimulating. So is the dog. But it doesn't quite replicate that sort of haphazard, you meet someone and suddenly there's an idea you hadn't thought of.
Yeah, the social connection is what we're all missing, be it at work or at home and with family and friends. But certainly in terms of mentoring and training, we're seeing significant negative feedback from organizations about the loss of osmotic learning, as it's called. So yeah, that ability to overhear or to observe somebody more senior and experienced interacting with a client or interacting with colleagues and learning from that. So that's a really significant problem. And learning is one of the reasons.
In terms of architecture, in terms of the space, what do you do? What spaces are you creating to do that, to help?
Well, you create spaces for serendipitous interaction. So that is the opposite of a traditional office building, which was designed like a prison to keep people apart. So, individual offices were death to knowledge working and interaction. So it's about open spaces, it's about central staircases, it's about central coffee areas it's a bit like mall design. You engineer it so that people have to cross certain paths and interact with each other.
Yeah, Richard, have you got a favorite spot? I mean, we've talked about a couple of places already, but is there any building? I'm just trying to sort of describe a certain place that promotes that.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think going back to that whole company culture, it's very interesting. A very good friend of mine works in one of the top city law firms in London, lives in Oxfordshire. If you'd asked him in the summer of last year, do you think you're coming back to work? He was saying, no, I won't. I'm loving my study. I love the garden. I've got a great family. It's all good. Thanks very much. By September, they had realized that if you have a young, talented person coming out of a decent university with a law degree and they're choosing where they're going to go and work, if the answer to the question, am I going to learn on the job? Am I going to develop new skills? Am I going to come to meetings and meet my own client base? Am I going to be basically trailing you around and seeing what you do in the office? If another law firm says yes to all that, the answer is yes. But his law firm says, well, actually, no, the senior people are all in the studies in Oxfordshire. They don't have a firm anymore because all of that young talent will simply go to where they are going to learn on the job. So I think it's it's very commercially needed that people do come back and create that culture. In terms of favourite buildings or favourite places in London, I think the area around Spitalfields and it's very interesting tracing how the history of London works. If you go up Bishopsgate and look across the road from Spitalfields to Bishopsgate, it almost looks like a fortress wall there, which is exactly what it's been designed to be, to keep everyone in Spitalfields out when it was a really quite poor and rough area. Now it's become the funnest area in London, or one of them. British Land, who are the developers or owners of Broadgate, which is where the other side of Bishopsgate is, are desperately trying to make that wall more and more permeable as the fun stuff can pour into Broadgate. So I guess my message is that what is fun about Spitalfields, it's really not even about the real estate above it. It's about everything that's going on at ground floor level, the ability to socialize very easily. The fact that you can easily get there is obviously a factor, but it is all about what goes on at ground floor level and everything that you can do around Spitalfields, definitely.
Nicola, I was reading your paper and your book, which talks about a real shift in responsibility within corporate culture. There's this The whole focus of a company was to provide income for its shareholders, and now that's being turned on its head. I want you to come to that in a second, but let's take a question from Simon Jackson, who's in London, and that feeds into this question as well. Go ahead, Simon.
I was interested in what Nicola had to say about corporate culture. To what extent is it perceived that corporate culture is formed by the physical arrangement of the workplace as opposed to the attitude of management? Personally, I think to a very large extent. And if that is the case, presumably if this remote working becomes permanent, it isn't so much a question, well, it isn't a question of it changing corporate culture, it's a question of changing what corporate culture represents.
Yeah, so I think it's about both of those things, and I think if at the moment this is the container we have to communicate culture and values, and this is not enough. This is two-dimensional, you can't interact with people, and it's really causing disengagement. But I think I'm a firm believer in the relationship between environment and behavior. I think the two are inextricably linked. So, as with a traditional command and control office building, that is reflective of what management wants. The modern office is much more about community and community spaces and experience for employees. So it's really, offices are the largest physical canvas to communicate brand and values for an organization. And if you look at those organizations that do that brilliantly, like for example, Google, it's some of these big brands, exactly what that organization's about when you walk through the doors. And that's what we're doing with most organizations now. So the days of the vanilla off the side of the motorway business park are over, thankfully.
But you also talk, Nicola, about the responsibility, and this is sort of corporate responsibility to the community around the people, the customers you work for. I mean, these are sort of old, they're not new ideas, but there's an extra push, an extra drive. There's an idea that companies can't get away with what they used to be able to get away. Can you talk a bit more about that shift?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's that shift, as has been talked about a lot, from shareholder to stakeholder value, and organizations can no longer drop a tower of power in the middle of a city and ignore everything around it. So that ground floor needs to be there to contribute to the surrounding area. And offices have been doing this for a lot longer in Australia, where the developments are not organized around 9 to 5, for example. They're organized around, going into the evening, being active and open at the weekend, which was one of the traditional issues with Canary Wharf, where it was dead at the weekend and nobody wanted to go there. And that's all changing now. But increasingly, employees are joining organizations and are asking, what are you giving back? If it's about making money for your shareholders, I'm not interested in that. What are you doing for the community? What are you doing for the environment? So that needs to become part of the package as well. And the environment and how it's created is a big part of that message.
We've got two questions that I'm going to get you to ask back to back, and that's Sue Serclocher and then Fran Hoffmann. So we'll have Sue first and then Fran. Go ahead, Sue, if you're there, please.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota, United States. Many workers are essential and/or manufacturing workers where I live. There doesn't appear to be the flexibility for these workers that exempt office professional employees can have to work remotely. Do you see any technology or equipment that would help these workers gain some workplace flexibility?
Okay, yeah. And then Fran Hoffmann, because your question is related to that. So go ahead, Fran.
Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating conversation. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm struck that we've talked a lot about changes in workplace structures and less about changes in home structures that are required if home work is to be successful. I watch my grown children trying to teach from their bedrooms, for example, because the space they live in is very small. So are corporations thinking about new benefit packages that help people establish viable home workplaces? And what are those conversations looking like?
Thank you both, Sue and Fran, for those questions. Two really good questions. And Nicola, I think we've got to sort of say that in a way we've been focusing on the sort of the big corporate beasts and perhaps the elites. And Sue's talked about manufacturing workers. There's a danger of that there's this enormous divide, the people who are working in an economy that's much wealthier, and then the gig economy, people who are working part-time and from home as well. So there's many layers to this, I think, as well.
Yeah, and most people are thinking in terms of knowledge workers who, of course, can work almost anywhere. I think within that, we've already started to see some shifts. So, for example, call centers, the wisdom pre-COVID was that you had to have call centers physically present. You had to have everybody physically there because they would get disengaged and sales would drop off. That's really shifted over the course of the pandemic. So people who are often sort of gig economy workers in a call center, they are increasing. They have had to work from home over the last 10 months. So the technology has proven that it works. So that is something that we're seeing becoming increasingly virtual. Now, there are issues with that around engagement and training and things like that. Also, if you look at R&D, so labs, again, scientists needed to be in labs to, tend to equipment, etc. But increasingly that's being done with software, and they're able to monitor equipment on their laptop from anywhere. So actually that's happening. And the same in manufacturing. I mean, if you look at, some of Amazon's manufacturing and distribution centers, and we're involved in quite a few of them. We don't design for humans there. We design for robots because that's what's running those buildings. So I think we're going to see a big shift there in terms of people working alongside technology, and eventually with some of these roles, technology taking over.
But I think coming back to both those questions, there's a huge amount of displacement taking place. If you think about people being moved out of manufacturing industries, but also if people are cutting back on their office space, purely to save costs and because it's cheaper to have people at home, what compensation is there? How should there's obviously must be a lot more thought going into how you support people at home, and that must be going on as well. Richard, are you familiar with something?
Well, I think Google, for example, gave every member of their staff an allowance of $1,500 to kit themselves out to be able to work at home properly, whether that was enhancing their Wi-Fi connectivity or getting a couple of screens for their desk or whatever. So yeah, and I think it has definitely been the case that larger employers have had to support their workforce as they've adapted to working from home. I still think it's very challenging to work at home if you've got inherent inbuilt issues like young children who are running around the house, or dogs who try and jump into your lap, as some of you may have seen a minute ago. So I think that's hard, but yeah, employers do have to are having to recognize that, and in the case of Google literally making that payment. It's interesting, one of the other things that Google have said in terms of this sort of flexibility, they have said, sorry, it's Facebook. They have said you can work from wherever you want to work, so you can give your base address as your home. But if you do give your base address your home, so say you work in the center of New York, but you live in rural New Jersey, that's fine. You can say in rural New Jersey is your base of work. They will pay you at a pay grade for a coder in rural New Jersey. They won't pay you a Manhattan wage. So that has made some people think about where they are actually going to base themselves, because it's obviously significant.
Okay. Being very honest, Nicola, can you see people being left out of that? There are companies that are going to, they're obviously under pressure, but people are being taken advantage of in this way. If you don't have to spend the money, don't.
Yeah, I think, physical and mental well-being are huge issues, and increasingly so. I would say vast majority of employers are acutely aware of that. I think they're at the beginning of effective programs that will address it. I think, until we get to a point, which there's been discussion about in terms of shortening the working week, I think until we get to that, I think it's going to be very challenging. I think, our organization does a huge amount in terms of well-being, yet, the hours Richard and I work are not pleasant. So I think there's a massive challenge there, but also in terms of, the broader displacement question. As certain jobs and roles disappear, others are being created, as has been the case in every industrial revolution. So the growth in jobs around well-being, leisure, health is huge, and that will continue to grow. So where people may previously have worked stacking shelves, they may find themselves retraining to become entertainers, to become masseuses, to become sports trainers, those kinds of things, which organizations will employ for their employees.
I think one of the things that's changed greatly is changing greatly in central London is the variety of uses. So where you would have had a fairly monolithic mix of just offices in an area, you're now seeing universities coming into London. You're now seeing life sciences come into London in a way that they never have done. So to Nicola's point, somebody who was doing one job now could easily be working as a researcher in a life science facility above Euston Station in 10 years' time, which is largely what's going to happen above Euston Station in 10 years' time. So things will shift around in that way too.
Nicola, the UK is notoriously London-centric, and if you look at other countries across Europe, they've got a much greater distribution of bigger cities. But with this shift in technology, before the pandemic, you see growth happening elsewhere. Can you talk a bit about why that's taking place?
Yeah, we were already seeing a shift from global city centers, New York, San Francisco, London, Hong Kong, towards secondary cities. And since then, and there's lots of secondary cities around the world, all around the world, that have grown great big talent pools around particular sectors, particularly something like technology. And in fact, the tech community is now spread all the way across the UK, for example. It's the same in the US. And what we're seeing over this period is a rise in the importance and value of regional cities to employers and hubs growing up around regional cities, especially those that are connected to good universities. Yeah. So, we don't think city centers are ever going to die, but we can see alternatives. So, for example, Cambridge in the UK, Cambridge in the US, where there are great big pharma and tech clusters around those universities. That's growing. I mean, the expansion of Cambridge is unbelievable, and the amount of employment that's in that area is unbelievable. And similarly, across the UK, where people can get a better quality of life at a better cost of living, there's going to be a much greater desire to do that. But again, this brings us back to the demographic point. Your typical talented 25-year-old is most likely to want to live in New York and London and Sydney. And then as people get kids and whatever it is, they'll be looking to move out to these other places.
Okay. There's also, I know there's different generations have got different preferences. We could come back to that in a second. I've kept Diane Cook waiting for too long. Transport is a key part of it, and travel. You've got a question about work and travel. So go ahead, Diane.
Yeah, it was really more a comment in which I think there might be a question, because Richard and Nicola, you both talked about sustainability. Oh, and by the way, I should add, I am in rural Suffolk, which is an English county, not the American one. And I have been working from home for most of this millennium. And I still do. And I miss going into London and meeting my colleagues. But when you're looking at companies which have a really trade around the world, my colleagues are missing getting on the plane. That what do you think will happen about the amount of international travel? Because if you have sustainability goals, you're not just going to be able to do it in one place. Having a wooden clad building isn't going to cut it.
No.
Yeah.
That's right.
What are your clients and customers thinking about there?
Can we expand that as well? Because I mean, we've got to talk about the commute, cars, transportation as well. So maybe deal with the international aspect of it first, and then come on to transportation as well. If you forgive me, Diane, for adding to your question. Nicola.
I can start off international if you want to do cars, Richard.
Sure.
Sure. So what we're very consistently hearing is that we will not go back to the way things were before. So clients are saying they will travel far less and far more purposefully than they ever have. So, I mean, all of us are guilty of getting on a plane for a 1-hour meeting, which just will not happen again. You know, that, and it was, we knew it at the time, never mind the cost, but the physical, you know, impact of doing something like that was just really a disgrace. We should never have let that happen. And, you know, I know that the 2020 carbon emissions globally are looking like they will only be at the level we should be at if we are to address climate change. And that took the world to almost stop to get to that level. So it's very alarming. So I think, you know, aside from a cost and a wear and tear point of view, I think organizations just will never go back to that level of travel again. But what they need to do is rechannel those crazy travel budgets into other things like technology and community engagement.
Richard, do you want to come with, so that's the international aspect of things. If you deal with real estate across the UK and globally, so any client you have has to be concerned about transportation, and cars and car parks must be the last thing that your clients really want.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a trend that was going on in London, central London anyway. I remember we worked on a scheme when it first became apparent that this is the way the world was turning, called King's Place, which is where the Guardian newspaper are based in King's Cross. It's not part of the overall scheme, it's just sort of next door to it. And we realized that the planning team at Camden would only give us 3 car parking spaces for a 250,000 square foot building, and thought we'd have a real problem. And there was no problem. It didn't even get raised by any single occupier that was looking at that space. And now it's perfectly normal to, it's funny, you get American occupiers coming over to London, and even to go and look at various real estate around London, they say, well, where are you going to meet me in your car? And it's like, how long do you want to take this tour to be? Because if we go in a car, it's going to take 4 days. If we go on public transport, it will take 4 hours. And so that central London has adopted. People still use the car a bit on a more UK basis, and obviously in America it's different. Again, and funny enough, Paris, which is a far bigger office occupational market than London, and has as bad, if not worse, traffic, the car is still widely used. But it is a trend that's going down, and it will continue to go down. I think it's a great shame that, you know, the much vaunted piece of infrastructure that London should have had 2 years ago, Crossrail. For those that don't know what that is, it's meant to be, or will be, an east-west express underground train, a little bit like the RER in Paris, which will turn a sort of hostile, nasty journey from Paddington to Liverpool Street, which would take you about 40 minutes to 10 minutes direct travel. But it's 2 years late, and you can already feel that London is feeling that absence. I mean, it started off when Crossrail began to become a thing. It felt, oh, that's a very nice thing. It's quite luxurious. Gosh, another big train thing for London. It's now, or pre-COVID, it's now feeling necessary. It needs to come very quickly in order to keep London being sustainable. But car use is going down, and I absolutely echo what Nicola says about plane travel. I mean, our budgets will be, and rightly will be, slashed, and conferences and things like that will be something I think people won't particularly go to anymore, or not at the scale that they do. So yes, I absolutely agree with that, and I think it's the right thing to be doing.
But Richard, you sounded slightly dismissive of concerns about public transport. I mean, we can see that the virus evolves, and we're going to have to live with this in some kind of changing form, even though many of us will have a vaccine, by September. Yeah. Traveling in a packed tube is not what people want to do.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think that's been the key blocker to people coming back into the workplace. Even when there was, in London anyway, there was a sort of bit of a gap between, was it sort of June to sort of getting in towards autumn, where people were coming in, and even then there were people who were very concerned about being on public transport and very consciously saying they didn't want to come in. And I think absent a virus, it remains a very significant problem. It really does, and there aren't any really two ways about it. And as I said at the top of the call, I think, you know, you can do almost what you want to an office environment, but if it's in the middle of the Square Mile in London or in the middle of Mayfair, and you've had to, you know, if you live outside London, you had to get a big train to one of the mainline stations, then switch to the tube, and then, you know, get into the office, you've already exposed yourself at very close range to people who might have the virus, and therefore it almost becomes irrelevant what your actual office environment is like. So absent a vaccine, I think, yeah, the public transport question is a very, very impactful one. It's the thing in an urban setting, I think.
Okay, Nicola, do you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think also back to the sustainability point, our employees don't want to work for people that, you know, you need to drive to get to work. And there was a very short sort of cheer at the beginning of the pandemic where, again, out of town business parks with acres and acres of car parking got very excited that they were going to make a comeback. Sadly not. But of course, it's the right thing to do. It's going to be, and you know, people are going to not travel as much. So they're going to, somebody mentioned earlier about local neighborhood hubs, and we're going to see more of those.
Well, yeah.
People will walk and cycle.
Okay. In a moment, I'm going to force both of you to try and do a kind of recap to draw your lessons from the pandemic in terms of how the workplace and how work is going to change. But I do want to get a couple more thoughts. If there's anybody in the States or Australia there, just to get a few more questions in, please do put a question down. Nicola, just on that point, can you see major shifts taking place between here and the US?
I think if we look globally, places like Australia and the UK were further ahead in terms of agile and flexible working programs. I mean, frankly, there are organizations here in places like Holland and Australia that have been working this way for 20 years. So there's nothing new. Places like the US, some parts are ahead, but the vast majority, it's a lot more conservative. And part of the reason for that is that they have a lot more land and it's cheaper than it is here. So that's one of the key drivers. And then there is a cultural overlay, right? I mean, we're doing a lot of work around Asia at the moment, and you know, people's home environments can be very different there, can be multi-family, multi-generational houses where it's simply not practical to work from home. So there's more of a cultural draw back to the office. So it does vary a lot by country.
That's a fascinating last point. Yeah, thinking about the different structure of households. Right, it's my turn to pick on you both now. Richard, your lessons from the pandemic. Go.
I think we've said it, but I think people will have to be persuaded to come into the office. I think amenities and what happens when you get to the office that is over and above sitting at a desk tapping away at a keyboard is going to make or break a workplace, make or break whether it's worth an occupier actually having expensive offices in London to start with. I think the other interesting thing that has become apparent over the last year or whatever it is that a lot of people have said, you know, maybe offices are following retail. You know, it only takes a bit of disruption to completely, it only takes one Amazon, which is actually not a huge percentage of retail sales, believe it or not, to completely disrupt the sector. I think I slightly disagree with that. And I think you should really consider which way the money flows. In a retail situation, you make the choice, you're the customer, you can go on Amazon, you can go to your local high street. In an employment situation, your employer's the customer and they have the choice about where the transaction takes place. So the money is flowing is actually it's not far from being similar, it's almost opposite. Because the money is flowing literally opposite to itself. And so I think things will normalize a bit more. People do feel a bit more obliged to come into the office, but that doesn't take anything away from the fact that, you know, as Nicola's been saying, the world has fundamentally changed, and that trend towards flex working has accelerated and will continue to do so.
Okay, Nicola, your turn.
I'd say the more virtual work becomes, the more important physical places for gathering and learning are. So there's a relationship between those two. I think there is no sense in trooping millions of people into cities with all of the carbon footprint associated with that in order for them to work silently, sitting in rows side by side. That won't happen again. I think offices are for communities of people. They're not for command and control management structures. And finally, I'd say designing the experience that the employee has in the building is as important as designing the architecture itself.
Great. Well, look, thank you both very much indeed. It's been a really good discussion, and thank you also everyone for your questions from around the world. So that's Nicola, Gillen and Richard Howard. That's been a really, really interesting discussion. Thank you both very much indeed.